Welcome to Folds and Curves. I'm your host, Mo Kashkush. Today's guest is John Donehoo. John is a clinical pharmacist by training, but he spends most of his time working towards a future where the space economy is open to everyone. He's the founder of Space Team and co-founder of the Pittsburgh Space Collaborative, and he consults for major commercial space enterprises. In fact, John couldn't record video today because of his current whereabouts, so today's episode will be audio only. I know John personally for his advocacy work that led to my student team having the amazing opportunity to send a microbial research project to the International Space Station. On this podcast, we talk about the future of space travel, human health and performance in outer space, and lots more. So let's get started. Okay. Hey, John. Thanks for coming on. So let's talk about space flight. Where do you see the future of human space flight?
Well, thanks. Yes, thanks for asking me to be part of this. It's a really exciting topic. The future of space flight. For the first time, right, we're going to hopefully be seeing non-professional astronauts. Right, this idea of private citizens, your neighbor, so to speak, all of us kind of average folks traveling, working, living, in space or on another planet. And it's really exciting to think about that because, right, for me, growing up as a kid, thinking about that, and for others, it's, unless you're a professional NASA astronaut, you never really thought it would be possible to go to space. But all that's really changing with commercial space flight, right? All these commercial companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Axiom, others that are working towards providing the means for all of us to access space and experience what it's like to travel there. So it's a really exciting time, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's definitely exciting and out of this world. No pun intended. But so I guess my question is, is there a roadmap out there? Obviously, you have different companies sort of with their own plans, but is there a general stepwise roadmap to getting, let's say, to Mars? Is it a straight shot there? Is it, first let's see how we do on the moon for a couple months? What does the roadmap look like?
Yeah, so right now it's kind of yes to everything. There's kind of the NASA plan, right? Kind of the traditional NASA plan, and then there's kind of the ambitions and plans for commercial companies. And they're not always the same or have to be. And then you kind of think internationally too, because it's not just the United States that right is kind of building the capacity and capabilities to send humans or have a greater presence in space. It's a lot of other countries out there that are doing it too. So with regard to a roadmap, I mean, NASA is probably the easiest one that we all can understand and relate to. And if you go on their website, they actually have a complete roadmap, right? Kind of in their general idea that they're gearing up for is to go back to the moon, right? But right, the statement was made, about a year ago that we're going to go back, but to stay, right? Have this idea of a permanent presence on the moon, and then use that to really enable us to go to Mars. Whereas some of the commercial companies, their idea might be, we're just going to go straight to Mars. And there's been a lot of debate about that. And I don't think there's really necessarily a right, a wrong, a better, way, but but it makes it really interesting. And I think what will help is that having these different approaches to this will help too, kind of that idea of diversity, right? To kind of see what's working, what isn't, how everybody can kind of learn so that improvements can be made, right? That's going to be just part of the inherent learning curve of all this is there's going to be things that go really well, right? And things that might not, but the idea is to do it, to,
Yeah.
kind of that idea of being bold, right? Go out there and really see what happens, but I think what we have going for us is, again, I mean, the group at NASA, the Human Research Program, incredible group, and again, their whole roadmap for human health and performance is something that you can access and learn about. And then with the commercial space companies, they got, just a really talented group of people committed, passionate about solving these problems so that all of us can hopefully have the opportunity to access space and explore and have this great experience.
Yeah, that would be like a dream come true for sure. I would personally love that, and I know you would as well. So let's talk about, you mentioned the human research program, and you talked about how certain things can go really, really well and other things can go not so well. So I'm kind of interested, this being like mostly a healthcare and biology podcast. I'm curious about some of the things that can go wrong, especially because I've always been a little bit skeptical about the prospect of somebody, living permanently in space. So what are these private companies and NASA doing to make that possible? Because I think that's a skepticism that a lot of people share. Or is this something we're working
Yeah,
towards?
absolutely. And it's not easy, right? Because I mean, again, I'd say arguably the NASA HRP group is the furthest ahead of any group of understanding human health and performance in space. And they, certainly have their approach, right? I mean, they're and what they do in their roadmap for understanding these problems and solving them is excellent. It's really interesting work. But to kind of answer your question is what can go wrong? Um, that's, I think, one of the biggest questions is there's so many things, right? Particularly when you think of doing this at scale, right? So for, traditionally it's just been, one, two, three, four professional astronauts, right? Like kind of like the perfect specimens, right? That are highly trained, that go to space, and to keep them right healthy and well is one thing. But the interesting and the really exciting part is how do we do this, right? If the idea is for the commercial space companies to send lots of people, right? Hundreds or thousands of people, is how do you do all this at scale, right?
Yeah.
And it's again the idea of, so you're in a, so think about this, you're in an environment, right? You're in space, you're in an environment that is literally trying to kill you, right? You're in a very hostile, right? You're in a very hostile environment, right? That is literally trying to kill you in a lot of different ways. And it's how do we kind of mitigate that? How do we minimize the risk and to enable you to survive, right, and thrive? That's really the big challenge. And I would say I feel very confident in where we're at. The people that are working to ask the right questions, solve these problems. I am highly confident that we have all the right people. They're doing all the right things. That we're going to be able to do this and had just an incredible experience. So it's and there's all different types too. I mean, the idea. So the risk might be different if you're just going in kind of a suborbital flight. You're only there, right, in space environment for say 5 or 10 minutes. Or then if you're going to the low Earth orbit, right, say on the International Space Station. And then, right, it's different if you're on the lunar surface or on the Mars surface. And then the time, right? Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it a year?
Yeah.
And so all those kind of go into this, these questions and problems that we have to solve. But I think early on, we'll probably just see very short durations,
Mm-hmm.
days, less than a week, really, so that we can learn, right? Provide people to have this experience, but do it safely, right? And we're going to learn a lot. And I think that's really going to open things up so that we can accelerate, right? Accelerate the pace by which we solve these problems.
Yeah, I think you brought up so many good points. I mean, first of all, scale, and not just sheer size, but also like what is this population of people going up there? Presumably, they're not going to be as fit as astronauts, who are some of the most fit and healthy people on Earth. Presumably, these are normal folks who may be a little bit overweight or may have diabetes, for example, and these are
Mhm.
people who are now going to be in space, and all of those pose interesting questions in and of themselves. And then you also talked about surviving and thriving, which I think is also a very important point as well, because well, is it good enough just if humans can survive in outer space, but if it's not necessarily a life worth living, or if it's a super difficult life that can't be adequately controlled, especially when you start to think about like populations and colonies on Mars? Is this an environment that you, would ethically allow a baby to be born on Mars, for example, if it wasn't the most conducive environment? So I think all of these questions are just, you could go so many directions with it, and there's so many endless possibilities and challenges to overcome. And so, sort of speaking of challenges, you said that space is just endlessly trying to kill you, and I'm curious, how are some of the ways that space tries to kill you? I think most people are familiar with, the lack of oxygen, but how else can space kill you?
Right? Yeah, having no air to breathe, that's a big deal, right? That's that's you know yeah, right? Just think about whenever you've gone swimming or something, like, right? Went underwater and you kind of come to that moment maybe, and you go, I need air, right? In this kind of frantic, wanting to get to the surface to get air, right? So pretty
Hmm.
important, right? And just with the basics, right? It's air, it's water, it's food, right? Just to kind of sustain those things, and then shelter, right? And then all the other things that really, outside of that, right? That expand,
Hmm.
but you need definitely those just basics to be there reliably. So right, space, yeah, no air. You have extreme temperatures, right? Depending on if the sun, right, is shining on you or not. So you got what's somewhere in the neighborhood of basically a 400-degree temperature difference, whether it's on the cold side or on the hot side, right? And you got radiation, which is a big one,
Yep.
and not just the radiation that we have here on Earth, right? Because our magnetic field and whatnot helps protect us from a lot of the really harmful radiation, like the gamma radiation, galactic cosmic radiation, and I think as they call it, which can penetrate, a lot of things, right? So it's a really hostile environment. But again, um, we've had astronauts, right? We've had people living in space for a long, long time, right? We had the Apollo missions, right? But then once you got, with the Mir and then Skylab, right? Then
Hmm.
the International Space Station. So we've had humans in space and living in space for a long time now, and we've learned a lot, right? So we know it's possible, right? Um, we know it's possible. We just now have to get much better at it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We've
So what's
already
the
proven that
longest?
it's possible.
Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna ask, what's the longest someone's been in outer space for any
Yeah.
one period
So
of time?
yeah. So there have been people that have been uh, uh, in space for longer than a year, and then there's definitely a lot of folks that have gone back. So cumulative time in space, right?
Hmm.
Um, and right, most recently was the I can't well popularized the twin study, right?
Yeah.
So right, the two astronauts, the twin astronauts, right? One went up into the International Space Station, the other, right, was on the ground to serve as the control, and we learned a lot from that. That was kind of a really unique, cool experiment that let us understand how, what kind of changes happen in space,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
do
That's a
they
really cool
return?
study.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think this is Mark and Scott Kelly, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a really interesting, I think, really cool experiment that we learned a lot. And it's the idea too that, right, I mean, think about it. A lot of it is, right, you've probably seen like astronauts exercising in space, right? And it's
Yep.
because, right, muscle mass, bone density gets lost the longer you're in space. And you need to maintain that. But then you think, well, that's because they're returning to Earth. Well, what if you said to you, well, you have no intention of returning to Earth? Do you need to do that?
Huh.
If you were always in a microgravity environment or a right or a reduced gravity environment, would it be that important? We don't know. But it's these kinds of really interesting questions that are fascinating, uh, right? It's just the idea of how do we know sometimes, right? Um, how do we know if somebody is healthy? How do you know beforehand? All these kinds of things all come into it. But, right, it's kind of a really interesting question. What if you had no intention of ever returning to Earth? Would your body just naturally adapt, and should you let it, right? It's this idea of how much should we interfere with the human body's, natural ability to adapt to an environment.
Yeah, I'm really
Um,
glad you brought that up. I never actually thought of that before. That's really interesting because I mean, you're right. If that's just the bone density that you need to live in space, why interfere with it? I guess, but to really understand that question, you'd probably need to look at a longer time period to see, how harmful that
mhm.
could be over time. But it's certainly an interesting point. I mean, I never even looked at it from that perspective. You just hear, decreasing bone density, you imagine that being a bad thing, but in space, maybe not necessarily so.
Yeah, it is. It's because we just know that, again, depending on what the duration was in space, that when you return, um, for the most part, you return to kind of like pre-space flight status, like, um, anything like if, vision problem, anything that you might have experienced in space or due to being in a microgravity environment, really for the most part, kind of return to baseline when you return. And so again, it's this idea of understanding kind of the before, during, and after, right?
Yeah.
Because, right, kind of how are you before? And based on that, are we able to kind of come up with this kind of a checklist, right? Of if you um, are kind of fit, right, for space. And then once you're there, how is your particular body adapting and interacting with the environment? And then when you return, right, was there any problems that might come afterwards that we have to learn about?
Yeah.
So it really is, it's the before, during, and after that we want to know.
Yeah.
It's
And I
really,
think,
it is. It's the ultimate challenge, really, to understand this.
yeah, it's certainly a challenge. And I mean, when you think about how we're used to doing a randomized control clinical trial here, on Earth for medications and, medical devices and things like that, or really even just observing two different populations over time. You can't really easily do that in space right now in large numbers, just because of how few people are up there at any given time. But I think that twin study you mentioned is just a super innovative way to, despite those sort of scientific challenges and understanding human health in that before, during, and after, framework that you described, they were still able to get some good information, with the major caveat being that you have a sample size of just 2 patients, Mark and Scott Kelly. But just to kind of go through the study for people who aren't familiar with it, you basically had one of the brothers on Earth for about a year, and the other twin brother in outer space on the International Space Station for a year. Both obviously have very similar genetics. Um, I think they're both similar build, and similar health status. Um, and what they did was they just took a whole giant series of different biological panels and health studies. They looked at their vision. They looked at their microbiome. What else did they look at that you could tell us about?
Yeah, it was. It was really a landmark study, right? Because they wanted to really better understand the impacts of space flight on a human body, through this study by using identical twins, right? And as you said, both Scott and Mark, right, are astronauts. But it was this idea that, right, now you had kind of for the first time this control group, right? And again, when you're looking at it from the clinical science and research perspective, your ends are one, right? You have ends of one here, and we know that there's a reason why we don't do that here on Earth, right? There's a reason that we have, hundreds and thousands or tens of thousands of people in clinical studies, because that's just how we know that we have a much higher confidence, right, level. But here with astronauts, again, there's a couple reasons for it, right? One is that you only have so many people in space at any given time, but you also have to say that the reason you have to be really careful what you do, because if something goes wrong in space, it's not that you can just go to the emergency room, right? You can't just quickly provide intense or high levels of care right there if something goes wrong. So that's, those are some of the reasons why, experiments, research with humans is really difficult, because again, we don't want to put these folks, in a bad position, because there's, again, if something goes wrong, then you're kind of limited in how you can respond. But
Yeah.
there's a lot that we can do. So again, with the twin study, right, there were a lot of really cool points that came out of this, right? It demonstrated kind of the resilience, right, and robustness of how a human body can adapt to a multitude of changes induced by the spaceflight environment, right? We saw that Scott's gene expression levels returned to normal. I think it was within about 6 months. There were some other kind of epigenetic changes that occurred with Scott, but they weren't really much more than Mark on Earth. There was actually a flu vaccine administered in space, and we learned that it essentially worked exactly like it does on Earth. So that was really exciting. And then kind of the microbiome, right? This idea of what's happening with the human microbiome, with all the different stresses that happen in space and in microgravity. And even those weren't, markedly different between Scott and Mark. We also, I think the other key thing is here that there was a lot of people involved in that study. So it was, I think you had probably about, a dozen or so universities across 8 states that were involved in this. So we, had a lot of people looking at this and helping out to really understand it. Because I think one of the things that we're also hoping to understand is aging, right, that we're getting out of this. Because we found that from this study, the research, from like the ongoing telomeres investigation aboard the space station, I think is really going to help our understanding of the significance of how Scott's telomere dynamics and behavior, right? They kind of lengthened in flight,
Huh.
and how that can help us understand, again, the aging process and things. So it was a really a landmark study that I think will serve as the basis for future studies in this area. So we'll see what people come up with. And I think, again, that's kind of the exciting part, is how everybody will decide to approach this problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. And just so I understand correctly, when someone's telomeres lengthen, that would suggest that does that mean they're reverse aging or aging slower? Is that what that would
Yeah.
suggest at least?
Yeah. So and they kind of returned to this, lengthening, and they did return, my understanding, they did essentially return to baseline
Okay.
upon returning. But I think it's all those kinds of questions that, again, what does this mean? What is it telling us that we
Mm-hmm.
didn't know? Or is it trying to say that, are we asking the right questions
Yeah.
when it comes to this? But I think it really just opened up, I think it just opened up the idea that there's more to learn, right? That to help us think about our work differently, and our approaches, that,
Yeah.
how can these kinds of events help not just what we know in space, but how can they be applied here on Earth, right? I think that's the other thing, is that kind of this dual purpose, right? Are there things that space allows us to learn and understand that will help certainly human health and performance in space, but maybe some of what we learn will actually help us here on Earth as well, right? And I think that's one of the really cool things about doing, right, that we found about what microgravity does, is it allows us to do something essentially that's impossible here on Earth, right? How to just, different processes, biological, physical processes, how are they different in microgravity? And what does that then enable us to do and learn in space?
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that's sort of interesting, I think, that you brought up, is not just this, I think, natural question that we all have, which is what happens to our bodies in outer space, what happens to our health, but also, well, what do you do if something goes wrong? There is no emergency room. I like how you mentioned that a flu vaccine was given in space, because it sort of brings me to the next point, which is, um, how do we innovate not just around figuring out how human health changes in space, but how to treat diseases in outer space, both from like an operational perspective of, for example, which drugs do we bring to outer space, because maybe they don't all work as well in outer space, or they might not be chemically stable, for example, all these different considerations that might now change. Um, but also, can we do surgeries in outer space if needed? Can we deliver babies? All of these sort of process driven um, items, or services, or however you want to think about it, these operations might not be really feasible just from a capacity or capabilities perspective, regardless of, you know, if we understand the biochemistry or the biology or the pathophysiology. Can we actually do something about it?
Yeah, it's a right. That's a great question that I don't. It's difficult to answer too, because we're just not sure, right?
Right.
First, it's what has happened, what have we learned, and what does that tell us about what we need, right? What kind of capabilities will be needed. And then as time goes on, again, as you try to think this at scale, about, right, hundreds or thousands then of people, what are we going to learn? And then from that, what are we going to need? It's, I think, anybody's guess. And I think it'll just be like the evolution of most things, right? We'll be sending, right, a lot of people early on, probably for very short stays. And then we'll begin to understand what exactly it is that we need, right?
Yeah. And I think
It's
that makes
tough. I
sense.
mean, but at the same time, right, futuristic, you can see essentially many of the same things that we just, right, consider part of our everyday lives in some form or fashion needed in space, particularly if you're thinking of colonizing, right? So it's not just a short stay with the intent of returning, it's staying there. And how do we, again, make that possible, I just don't know. I'm looking forward to finding out, though, aren't you? I mean, that's part of what this is
Yeah.
I think, what is the right approach? And I think you have probably that's where I think you get a lot of interesting discussions of how are we going to approach this,
Yeah.
and then are we prepared to then act on it, as we start to learn. And I think the big part is just, kind of what we talked about at the beginning, is that, the people that are signing up to do this, right, and want to do it, we need that, right? That's the whole idea, is that, people, again, private citizens, non-professional astronauts, passengers, right? Just like you think of in an airplane, passengers aboard an airplane, willing to be a part of this, right? I think is really powerful. We need that, right? That's
Yeah.
that are willing to want to be a part of this, to help us understand and figure these things out.
Yeah. And by the way,
It's important.
put everything at risk too, right? Because when I think about this field, I think that there is definitely ways to do it in a risk-averse way, or a less risky way, a way where you do it stepwise, as you mentioned, maybe just short stints at first. But I think eventually you do reach a time where someone has to say, "I'm going to be, the first man or woman on Mars," and there may not be an escape route or a way back, and we might not have all the calculus figured out. And there's going to be at some point someone who needs to sort of make that leap, without, with imperfect information. And I think, we definitely need those people, because there is a huge risk to being the first one.
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting, though, and like you said, not to be taken for granted, because again, I think all of us are, excited and romanced about the idea of going to space, right? Experiencing this, and then, right, it's kind of then matched with the realities of it. And I think there's one of the reasons, right, why astronauts, could take like years before they actually fly is, there's a lot to understand. Are you physically able to go to space and withstand, the stresses and things, and then psychologically? So it's not just you, but you in the context of a team, right? So, I mean, think about this, the last time you went camping, right? With, a few people, and you're all in this tent for like a week in the woods, and saying to yourself, wow, this is fantastic. I could do this for months, or is it, man, I cannot wait to get home and take a shower, right? Or the last time you went on a long car ride, right? You're in this car with 3, 4 other people, and, within a couple hours, you're hungry, or you just want to get out and stretch, right? Or you want to turn on the radio, all these things, and then it's just like, you can't wait to get out of this car. Well, imagine being in, right, this capsule or this vehicle
Mm-hmm.
for 9 months to get to Mars, 9 months. And you can't just get out and stretch your legs, right? So yeah, it's a lot more than just the physical part, right? It's the psychological, the human behavior part of this that is extremely important
Yeah.
to understand. Because again, think about just how we've all been during COVID, right? Kind of at home.
Yep.
And how, right, before all this, you kind of go, man, it'd be great to just sit at home or do this at home. And now that you are, right, you kind of get a little stir crazy, right? And you don't want to be, kind of in your home. But again, so now think about you're in space, right? For days, weeks, months on end with other people and having, what are those dynamics like?
Yeah.
On top of everything. So I think that is a little bit about, we all want to, I do, I think it would be a phenomenal experience. But I think part of what we want to do and understand so that all those things that will allow us to have that great experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus kind of what you were saying, I think before, you're just surviving, you're just there, but are you there and enjoying it, right? At the same time. So I think it's, the physical, it's why, right? It's that human health and performance part, both the physical, the mental, that'll be really, really important. But again, just kind of draw from your own experiences when you've been, right, on a car ride or camping or something, and kind of what those little triggers were, what you kind of, you didn't have while you were camping or in that car ride that you just couldn't wait to do. And then imagine not being able to do that again for weeks or months at a time, right? So I think that'll be part of it too, is just preparing people for the experience itself. I don't think, who knows, maybe someday it'll be just like an airplane ride or a roller coaster, right? You just do it, there's not like really any prep. You just you got to get it, right? You understand, you have a great time. And
Yeah.
I think that's where we want to get to, but until then, will probably be a lot of, kind of upfront training and different things again, so that you can do it with confidence and provide people with a great experience so that they'll want to do it again, right?
Yeah.
And I think I do. I have every confidence that we are on track to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah,
So it is.
that's excellent.
But it'll take a lot of people to want to do that and help out.
Yeah. I think that's excellent. And you brought up a great point about the pandemic. Perhaps there was a bit of natural training in this last year where people who lived through this pandemic will be maybe just a little bit more accustomed to that mental isolation that you talked about. That's so important. That's so important to consider when you're talking about these long space flight missions. And I think that is often overlooked. Like, oh, no big deal. You'll just be by yourself for 9 months. But when you think about putting yourselves in that person's shoe, that could be 9 months of really like a miserable experience if you're just alone, or maybe you're with the same person. You want to meet other people. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it is. There's a lot to, there's a lot to consider. There's a lot to consider, but I feel really confident that we're gonna get, we'll solve these problems, right? We'll get, we'll be able to allow people to have a safe and really exciting experience in space. There's no doubt. As I said, you got a lot of just really talented, skills, dedicated people that are working on this, that will enable this to happen. And I'm really excited for it. Come on, we got to get, I think it's a great time to get excited about the future. I think this is something, right? The idea of being multi-planetary, or increasing access to space for all of us. I think is a really great way to get excited about the future. Kind of a reason to, look forward to things, right? Kind of to be inspired, right? To do these things. So I think that's one of the things that really captures people's attention, and why they want to be a part of it is this idea of, right, being bold, doing things, challenging the status quo, and, kind of looking at things that seem impossible and then showing that they really aren't. To me is why we have so many people that are involved in this, and that
Oh yeah.
we'll make this happen. It's a great time. I think this is really a great way to, again, get excited about the future and human space travel, and these companies, right? These commercial space companies that are enabling us, right? We're getting really close, right? We're going to be seeing, I think, more and more non-professional astronauts, this idea of passengers traveling into space here in the next couple of years. And it'll be a really, I think it'd be an interesting moment to see how this is viewed, how it's regarded. And then what happens after that, how those kind of moments really change things. When we see these, right, kind of your next door neighbor, coming to you from space, right, is, I think, right, you know what I mean, is this idea of, hey, I can see myself doing that, I want to do that, right, I think is really cool.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on that. I think even people who aren't involved in space research like you are, or in these companies or with NASA, I think it really even captivates a general audience. I think from the moment we're all young children, we all think outer space is just the coolest thing. I have a picture in my room of me pointing to a picture of what I want to be when I grow up, and it says astronaut. And I think a lot of kids share that, but it sort of seems so far-fetched that no one actually considers pursuing it, and it's so selective and only few people can go. But maybe not one day. I mean, maybe we can all look up to the stars one day, and I think everyone's inspired by that, whether it's an astronaut or just a normal person.
I mean, just look at the trajectory of, right, aircraft, right? Kind of went from the Wright brothers to an airline industry, and then the next thing you know, we're traveling into space, landing on the moon, right? And we have this International Space Station, and over the course of not that long, right? We kind of go right from the Wright brothers' first flight until where we're at now of talking about, right, being able to send hundreds and thousands of people to space.
Mm-hmm.
It's really amazing, right? So again, think of just right from that first airplane, that first flight, into what we understand now about commercial flight, right? We kind of take it for granted.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really think about it too much. We just do it. It's just part of our natural, life is with aircraft. And I think that's part of what we'll see here.
Yeah.
And it's at the beginning stages, which I think is really a fascinating time. Again, think about it. We're talking about this kind of transformational moment in human existence where we're going to become, right, we're on the real pathway to becoming multiplanetary.
Yeah. Well, here's to a future of a multiplanetary species, and here's to a future to taking space flight for granted because it's so normal. And
right?
I know you got to get going, so I don't want to hold you any longer. Was there anything else you wanted to sort of share with the audience before you head out?
Yeah, I would say, just think about, there's so many ways to experience space, and it's we all kind of think about the astronaut, right, when we think of space, perhaps, and that maybe like what we aspire to. But I would say that but we need, in order for this to work and continue to, grow, we need so many different skill sets and people to get involved, right? And I would say, usually it's, hey, what kind of careers or skills are needed, for space. I would argue that to look at it a little bit differently, say, what are you really passionate about, right? What excites you? What do you feel like you're really good at? And then looking for an application in the space sector to apply that to. And I think that way you'll enjoy it more, and we'll all benefit from that, instead of trying to fit into some category or a job or something like that. I mean, you need engineers, you need communications, you need all sorts of the people that make spacesuits. Again, food, water, clothing. Again, think of it more. What are you really passionate about? What are you really excited about? And then maybe there's a way to apply that to the space sector and building the future, right? Really building the future. I think that's what makes this really exciting, and something for everybody, something for everyone.
Yeah, sounds like there's a spot for everyone in space.
There is.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks so much, John, for coming on. I'll let you get going now. It's truly been an honor to speak with you. Just knowing you personally, you've done a lot for the space community, and I hope some of our listeners are inspired by the way you see the future, and hopefully they can see the future in their own way, but maybe in line with the way you see it. And I think it's a really bright future. So thanks again for sharing some of your perspectives, and I'll leave some ways to find you down in the show notes below, and
Sure.
hopefully some of our guests reach out and check out some of the work you're doing. It's really incredible stuff.
No, and I agree. Thank you, Mo. You've done a tremendous job. And I think these are great ways to generate conversation and dialogue about this, right? To get difference in opinions and visions and things like that. So I think programs like this are really important to start the conversation, get people talking about it, interested. I think is really, really important. So I applaud you for everything that you're doing.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you want to learn more about John, please check out the show notes. I'll link to some of his presentations and LinkedIn profile. Thanks, and take care.